Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Hypothetical. You find yourself, as you come groggily awake, drifting on a life raft in the middle of an ocean. Well, you take stock. What supplies do you have? Is there any GPS coordinates? Not much. What are your priorities? Shelter. Good. Maybe you can rig up some sort of tarp in this little raft to protect you from the ocean sun. Water. You may be surrounded by water, but I've heard before that water everywhere and not a drop to drink. You're going to need to make sure that you have water. And of course, Shabbos. Shabbat. This has to be part of your considerations. You're waking up, you're groggy, you have no idea what day it is. What if that day that you're waking up is Shabbat? What if tomorrow is Shabbat? What if yesterday were Shabbat? What if 3 days from now were Shabbat? Now, you may think this is a pretty far-flung hypothetical, but indeed it's in the Talmud, a discussion of exactly this point. Not so often from being lost in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, because people didn't go there if they could avoid it. Mediterranean a little bit, but you're not too far from shore. But what about in the desert? You're on a caravan stretching between Israel and Egypt, between Israel and the Babylonian communities. You become lost in the storm and you lose track of time. How many days has it been since you've been marching through this wasteland, trying to get to the next village, in the direction at least you can tell by the sun? Well, what about Shabbat? There are two schools of thought. The first school says, as soon as you come to and realize that you are no longer aware of what day it is, then the day that you are on, that becomes Shabbat, and then start counting days from that point forward, and every seventh day, again, observe Shabbat. The second school of thought says, no, from the day you wake up, begin counting, and after you have counted 6 days, the seventh day will be your Shabbat. Now, do we have any preferences for these two positions? Does either seem to make more logical sense to you?
The seventh day.
The start counting 6 and then on the 7th. But won't you be almost guaranteeing that you are passing through Shabbat? I mean, you only have a 1 in 7 chance of being right.
You always only have a 1 in 7
You always
chance.
only have a 1 in 7 chance of being right. But what if today was Shabbat? I could have gotten it right. Whereas if I wait 6 days, I'm missing out on today. What if today were Shabbat?
What happens if tomorrow's Shabbat?
What happens if tomorrow is Shabbat? Well, indeed, in the end of the argument, the halakha comes down on the side of count 6 days, and then the 7th day keep as your Shabbat. But those other 6 days, you should still limit your melacha, limit your work, your labor, just for what you need for survival purposes. So this is not a good time to just be writing out your memoirs or filling in crossword puzzles. But if you need to catch a fish, if you need to dig for water, then yes, of course, you're allowed to do that, but you should minimize what you need to do. The rules of malacha, the rules of labor are still in effect, set aside only for survival purposes. Now you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute. I'm in a survival situation. Is Shabbat really foremost of my mind? I mean, is this really a priority up there with food and shelter and water and all of the other things that go into these types of dire circumstances? Well, obviously our ancestors believe that yes, this should be on our mind. And indeed, we see this reflected in this week's Torah portion, one of the most famous passages, one that I would imagine many of you will recognize. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael. Right? Sounds a little familiar. What is it that v'nei Yisrael, the children of Israel, are shamruing, to make a mockery of both English and Hebrew simultaneously? What is it that we are protecting and keeping in that passage from chapter 31? Shabbat. But where it comes within the Torah text tells us something very insightful. Because it isn't just in a long discussion of Shabbat itself. It actually comes within a long discussion of preparations for building of the Mishkan, for the tabernacle. And it is framed in such a way that that section that it is reminding us that even though God has given you the commands to build the tabernacle, to build the Mishkan, not on Shabbat. Even such an important job as building this beautiful shrine that will be with our people for hundreds of years until eventually replaced by the temple, it does not supersede Shabbat. On Shabbat, we rest. And in fact, it is because of the juxtaposition here and elsewhere that we learn the types of melacha, the types of work that are prohibited on Shabbat, are those types of work that were involved in the construction of the Mishkan. That if it wasn't okay to do this for the Mishkan on Shabbat, then it's not okay to do that for any other purpose on Shabbat either. Sort of going from the Kal v'chomer case. If I can't do it on Shabbat, then certainly if I can't do it for the Mishkan, then certainly I can't do it for any more mundane or trivial purposes. But that juxtaposition tells us something else as well. Putting up Shabbat next to the Mishkan is not just about helping us learn the halakha, learn the law. It's about identifying the 39 categories of labor that are prohibited on Shabbat, although those are good, you should learn them. You can go back and review your Mishnah class with me if you were there, or we can study it on our own. It is also telling us something about Shabbat. It is telling us that Shabbat is a substitute for the Mishkan. Shabbat doesn't need the Mishkan, and in fact, in many ways, Shabbat is superior to the Mishkan. Shabbat is a symbol of our relationship to God that is even more powerful than the symbol of the relationship that is represented in the building of the tabernacle, of the temple, or even a synagogue, dare I say. That Shabbat is infinitely portable. Shabbat is infinitely accessible. Shabbat has a zero entry cost to participation. And Shabbat is something that even if you are adrift in the sea or wandering in the desert, you can create. The reason why our ancestors wanted to make sure that as we wandered through our survival situation that we still observe Shabbat was because they knew that through Shabbat we would find a source of strength, a source of hope, and a source of understanding that whatever our current situation, we were still connected to God. And by carving out this time of Shabbat, even if we only had a 1 in 7 chance of being the right day, nonetheless, by carving it out in this situation, we would have a 100% chance of feeling the presence of God in our most desperate hour. And to just continue to go day after day after day without that connection to God was a tragedy. We can survive without the Mishkan. We can survive without the temple. And again, dare I say it, we can survive without a physical synagogue building. Not that we should, and that's why we keep fixing the roof and things. But we cannot survive without Shabbat. We cannot survive without that temple in time, as Rabbi Heschel put it, without this sanctuary, this island that is carved out for us if we will allow ourselves to take shelter there for those blessed hours of Shabbat. Shabbat rejuvenates us, it reinvigorates us. Literally, we are vayinafash, we are granted additional spirit on Shabbat. And even if we are in the midst of our troubles, slightly off from the official calendar Shabbat, we still have to reach out to try and create that space for ourselves. We are not commanded in a survival situation to build a synagogue. We are not commanded in a survival situation to build the Mishkan. We are commanded, however, in all situations, to build Shabbat. Allow yourself that safety. Come into its safe harbor. Feel yourself at peace in its oasis within whatever the week is throwing and whatever the week will eventually bring. Here within its safety and security, we can feel the presence of God with nothing standing between us. Shabbat Shalom.